Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be discussing the fat-free mass index and how that relates to musculature. So we're going to be basing it around the concept of, or the context of, muscle gaining. So when it comes to being able to determine if a person is a natural athlete or if they are on their creatine, as people like to joke around, otherwise known as steroids. So, just to be clear, creatine is not a steroid. It's a joke in the bodybuilding community. But the fat-free mass index is often used to get that kind of line between what's natural or who's natural, what's attainable naturally, and who's taking those exogenous levels of testosterone and steroids and all that stuff. So we're going to talk about what the fat-free mass index is, how it relates to a general population, and we're going to also talk about how we can relate that to actual muscular development and see if we can actually get some numbers out of that correspond, and that we can actually get an accurate reading of if a person is natural or if they are on steroids. Now, of course, naturally, just like any of these informative videos that I've got up, there is an article with all of my peer-reviewed research that I have reviewed down below for your convenience, and as well as more details in that article. So, without further ado, if you want to skip ahead, then also check out the menu system, which is linked below, and it will pop up at the end of this introduction. Alright, that said, let's go ahead and get started, shall we? And as usual, first things first, what is the fat-free mass index? Fat-free mass index is very similar to the body mass index, which is vastly popular. Many people, many researchers use the BMI, body mass index, to determine the health of a person in general terms. So it's very easy to use, just a quick calculation, and then you get to determine if a person is underweight, normal weight, overweight, or obese, or different categories of obese. Now, when it comes to the fat-free mass index, it is very similar to the body mass index. However, what it takes into consideration is that difference between fat mass and fat-free mass, which is something that the body mass index does not do. So that is why, or where, or what the fat-free mass index is and where it comes from. So how is the fat-free mass index formulated? Well, like I said in the previous section, it is very much like the body mass index. However, of course, it creates that distinction between fat mass and fat-free mass. We're going to be focusing on fat-free mass for the fat-free mass index. Obviously, it makes a lot of sense. So that said, it is so similar to the body mass index that is actually exactly the same in terms of its actual formula. So the body mass index is kilograms of total body weight over meters squared, so meters of height squared. So we're going to be using that metric system. However, when we're talking about fat-free mass index, again, we are using kilograms, but we're only going to be looking at kilograms of fat-free mass. So we're not looking at fat mass, which is something, again, that body mass index would look at, kind of clump those two together. But we're trying to separate those two because it's more indicative of health, of overall body composition. So fat-free mass index uses kilograms of fat-free mass, so you'd have to know your body fat percentage to be able to get that kilograms, and then divide that by meters squared. So again, the exact same as body mass index. You would have your height converted into meters and then square that and divide that into the kilograms. And I'll have it displayed on the screen so you have a better visual. So is it useful? It is useful actually in two different ways. One of them is more general population in terms of more of a medical screening style. So a lot of people, a lot of researchers, a lot of medical doctors use the BMI to determine if a person is overweight, obese, etc., like I mentioned. And the issue with that is that some people are simply very muscular, so they have a lot of fat-free mass on them, which is a metabolically healthy tissue, something that burns a lot of calories, that uses a lot of calories. And to clump those in with people that are overweight because they have an excess fat mass is not an appropriate way to go about classifying between the two. So fat-free mass can aid in that by getting rid of false positives and false negatives. So what are those? Of course, a false negative is when you have people that, if you were to base it off BMI, so body mass index, you would see that those people are of normal weight. But in reality, they have such high fat mass and such low fat-free mass, which again, that fat-free mass is a good thing because it's metabolically active. So that being the case, they would fall into the normal range, which is considered the healthy range in BMI terms, but fat-free mass index would then determine, no, they are actually not healthy. They may be of a normal weight, but their composition of that weight is actually in a detrimental range. On the other side, people that are very strong, that have a lot of muscle mass, they may be overweight. As a matter of fact, I am overweight right now. I am in that 25 to 30 BMI range. However, even at my heavier ranges, when I weigh about 250, then I get right around that obese. I get close to that obese level, but I don't really look obese. So it allows for that elimination of that top end as well, separating people that truly are obese or truly are overweight because they have excess fat mass compared to the people that just are muscular. And BMI does not do that. It does not distinguish between those two. So that's a shortcoming of BMI, which is where fat-free mass index can come in and be very helpful. On another note, however, and people that are in the lifting community care about this considerably more than anybody else, but fat-free mass index can also be useful in terms of determining if a person is a natural lifter or they are a steroid using lifter. So fat-free mass index can give us an indication, at least a rough indication. I'll go a little bit more into that with the next section, but it does give us a general indication of what a natural lifter should look like in terms of numerical terms and what a steroid lifter could look like in terms of, again, those numerical terms. So fat-free mass index has two uses. Now in terms, there are of course a few discrepancies and a few criticisms that people have of the fat-free mass index, and I will mention those in the next section. But those two are definitely some of the uses of fat-free mass index. I love Sour Patch Kids. Alright, so the natural limit. What can fat-free mass index tell us about the natural limit? Well, there's been very few studies that have actually directly looked at fat-free mass index, but the few that have, there's actually one that specifically looked at natural lifters and steroid using lifters. And that's why it's such an interesting study and why it's highly applicable to this video as well as many other videos, why a lot of other lifters and people that are in the fitness industry talk about it. So this study looked at 157 young men, and they went through an interview process with these 157 men, and asked them if they had used or are using steroids in the past, or like I said, were using steroids at that time. And it turned out that a certain number said yes, a certain number said no, and then they verified that with a urine test immediately after the interview. And of course there was no incentive to lie because, well, it's a study, and if they rat out every single person that they try and study, well, nobody's going to show up for these studies. So they did, it was all confidential, so there's no reason for people to lie. And the odds of 157 people lying and getting away from their urine test is highly, highly, highly improbable. So most likely this study is going to be pretty accurate, and I'll talk about a few limitations later on, but overall I think the study is pretty well done. Okay, that out of the way, so let's say we assume that people were telling the truth, and there was actually more people that used steroids than non-steroid users, which was actually a little surprising to me. But anyways, with the fat-free, they then categorized them, looked at their weight, looked at their body fat percentage based off of skin fold measurements, and then came up with their fat-free mass index, and then were able to categorize where a person would fall. So it turns out that when it comes to natural lifters fall between the average natural lifter falls between anywhere under 22. So a fat-free mass index of 22 or lower would be indicative typically of a natural lifter, a normal, average natural lifter. Now, a gifted natural lifter, a person who has good genetics, good nutrition, top of their sport, working really hard, let's say top of their sport in their region. We'll just kind of base it off that. So very good, right? They would be between about 22 to 25. No one had a higher FFMI than 25. 25 was the cutoff point in terms of gifted and just regular natural lifters. And all of these men were lifters. So this is not just like noobs or just random people off the street, although there is a study that looked at random people off the street. Of course their FFMI was nowhere near what these people were, because they were actively trying to change their body composition to increase their FFMI. So that said, gifted natural lifters are around 22 to 25. Now, they also looked at Mr. America. So if you know anything about bodybuilding, there is a competition called the Mr. America competition, which is very similar to the Mr. Universe and the Mr. Olympia competitions. And they looked at the Mr. America winners from the last 20 years, from the year 1939 to, I believe, 1959. I believe it was 1939. I think that's the start off. And the reason why they looked at those is because steroids had not been invented during this time, or at least it had just started to be invented and wasn't being used in human trials. So that being the case, you can be relatively certain, you can be 100% certain in those first at least 5 years from 1939 to 1944 that nobody was on steroids. 100% certain nobody was on steroids. And these are the pinnacle, Mr. America, the best in all of the United States. We are talking the top talent, not just gifted, but top talent. And they're the winners of those top talent people. So those 5 years you can be 100% certain they're non-steroids, and the other 15 years you can be about 90-95% certain that they weren't taking any steroids, or at the very, very, very worst, were taking extremely low doses of steroids, which I highly doubt. Honestly, I would go with, we are pretty certain that they were natural. So, what was their FFMI? Well, you had some that were in their 22, 23, so we're talking about gifted naturals that won the Mr. America, all the way up to 28 FFMI. And there are only 3 people, 3 out of 20 years of Mr. Americas that hit over 27. So 28 was the highest amount achieved. So what does that tell us? That means that there are very, very, very few people that are between that 25 to 28 range. Now, let's discuss steroid users. Steroid users tended to clump together around that 25 range. You had a few, very, very few that were right around that 19 range. So just because you're small does not mean that you're not on steroids, okay? But the vast majority clumped around that 25. And then we had on the other extreme, we had some that were over 30 FFMI. That's huge, huge. When we're talking about like Mr. Olympia today, we're talking over 30 for sure. So these guys are definitely on steroids, no doubt about it. So what does that tell us? Of course, there's going to be still a hazy region, and I think that's one of the limitations of the FFMI. Because if you have that hazy region where you have those Mr. America level competitors, even a few of those gifted naturals that are in that ballpark of what an average steroid user. So gifted natural compared to average steroid user that lifts. You have this hazy region that the FFMI simply cannot distinguish between. You would need biomedical markers to actually determine if a person is on steroids or not on steroids. That said, we can be 100% certain, or just about 100% certain, that anybody over 28 is going to be on steroids. Even people from 25 to 28, they would have to be just insane on nutrition, great training, incredible genetics, etc., etc., and they would fall within that 25 to 28, because again, that's that Mr. America level. Now, I do want to quick point out one other limitation, is that they assume, because this is retrospective, so they had to look back at the numbers for their weight, for their height, etc., for these Mr. America contestants, these winners. They had to look back, so they couldn't necessarily do body fat measurements on these people. So that being said, that means that they just had to assume that their body fat percentage was between 4 and 6%. So they assumed it was 5%. I disagree with that. I do not think that these people were 5%. This is simply purely by just what I know, what I've seen, what is truly 5-6% body fat. It is much lower than one would assume. I think these guys were around maybe 7-8% body fat, I would say. So that said, I think their FFMI is a little bit out of the range that they really are. I think that the 28 might have been 27.6 or 27.7, and everybody's just dialed back maybe like 0.1, 0.2 points on that FFMI. Is it going to make a huge difference? No. So we'll just assume 28 is right about that cutoff point for extremely gifted, on top of their nutrition, extremely knowledgeable, non-stop, like their life is training, they're constantly progressing. Then it's possible to get up to 28. But the average person who goes in the gym and gives it their best effort and has great genetics, they're going to be around 25, 22 to 25. Okay, and the last limitation is that the actual skin fold measurements are not necessarily accurate. They are accurate within about 5%. There is a margin of error there, but if we assume that that margin of error was for every single person, and if it was standardized based on the same person taking that skin fold measurement, then we can assume that that standard of error will be roughly across the entire board. So all 157 people that were in the lab that actually were researched upon, not the retrospect not the retrospective on the Mr. Americas, the actual lifters that were taken, those 157 men, then we can say that that margin of error would apply to all of them. So is it much of a big deal? Probably not. Would it change the FFMI? Yeah, possibly, but it would change it all across the board, which would mean that we would have a decrease or increase. So that ratio of what a natural is to a steroid user, that would stay the same. It's just the absolute numbers between the two could potentially change a little bit. Is it going to make a huge difference? No. Okay, so hopefully that got across. So, and if it didn't, I've got everything clarified below, or again, just check out the summary section, which is coming up next for a recap. This is the summary of the video for those of you that need a quick recap. If not, please subscribe and check out the attached article. Alrighty, welcome to the summary section if you did not want to go through the entire video and you still wanted to get the information in a highlight format. So the fat-free mass index is basically the same thing as the body mass index that is used in a lot of medical work, in terms of research, in terms of doctors, looking at a general idea of what a person's body weight is relative to the population. So that said, fat-free mass index, however, has the advantage of separating fat mass and fat-free mass. So what does that mean? That actually gives it a benefit, and I have an itch on my nose. And those benefits are twofold. One of them is that it gives a more accurate picture that BMI does not in terms of a person's health. So if a person is overweight because of actual fat mass, then they are overweight because of fat mass. However, if a person is overweight and they have a bunch of muscle on them, they should not be put in the same position as a person who is overweight due to fat mass. Fat-free mass attenuates that issue. That body mass index does not. And the other thing is that it actually gives us an idea of what a natural lifter, in terms of their natural potential, their natural ceiling is. And that ceiling can be determined through the fat-free mass index, which is quite nice. However, there are still issues, there's still hazy areas. Just because a person is natural, they could be extremely gifted and they could get a fat-free mass index that is similar to a steroid user, and a steroid user could be very small even in the case of using steroids, because they're not doing well on their nutrition, they're not doing well on their training, they don't know what they're doing, things like that. It can still have an impact, especially if you compare that to a genetically favored natural lifter that knows what they're doing, that knows how to go through their training, knows how to do their nutrition and whatnot. So just a quick numbers throwing out there. For if you have an FFMI of over 28, you are on steroids. That's according to the FFMI, and there is a study that looks specifically at this, natural lifters and steroid users. If you have an FFMI of 28, you are on, or over 28, you are on steroids. If you are between 25 and 28, you are Mr. America great. You have your physique. It's highly likely that you are on steroids, but there's a small chance that you are not on steroids, and you just are genetically gifted. You are among all genetically gifted people, you are the best. You are the highest. You are the bee's knees. You are incredible. Stroke thy ego, son. And then if you are between 22 and 25, you are genetically gifted. You are a natural, most likely a natural, and you are genetically gifted. Are you Mr. America great? No, but you are very good, very, very good. You know what you're doing. Your genetics are excellent. And applause to you. And finally, if you are anywhere below 22, then you are most likely a natural lifter, and you may have decent genetics, but the further down you go, you're probably a newbie, you don't know what you're doing in your training, you don't know your nutrition, etc., etc. So does FFMI deal with those differences, those hazy areas where these sections cross across one another? No, it doesn't, and that's one of its drawbacks, and that's one of the issues that people have with FFMI. But does it give you a rough idea? Yes. If a person has an FFMI of 30, they're on steroids, okay? Simple as that. They're just on steroids. There's no ambiguity there, and that's where FFMI can actually help out. Okay, well, if you found the video informational, please subscribe. It certainly means quite a bit to me when I see that subscription number increase, and you will most likely see an off-the-cuff episode later this week. Should be an interesting one. And yeah, you'll see another informational video next week. Next weekend, I guess I should say. And thanks for your support. Like, share the video if you want. All right, I will catch you in the next video. See ya.